He had no noble name, no lineage, no right to stand near the throne. But the emperor kept him close, in his stables, then in his bed. The woman the emperor loved was given to him as a gift. Some gifts you keep, others you kill for. She slept with both of them and gave birth to a son no one dared to claim. Then one night, the servant killed the emperor, kept the woman, and crowned himself king. This is not fiction. This is how a dynasty began, from the body of a slave. His name was Basil, but no one ever said it like it mattered. No titles, no father, no history worth recording. He came from the dirt and was expected to stay there. But dirt in Byzantium had a habit of clinging to the crown. He was a stable hand. His job was to keep the horses clean, not the court. He couldn't read, but he could break a stallion bare-handed. He couldn't kneel properly, but he could carry a noble on his back for hours. That was enough. His shoulders were wide enough to mount a saddle and broad enough to catch a royal gaze. He didn't speak much, didn't ask for anything, didn't protest when they told him to serve shirtless at the emperor's races. They said it was tradition. He didn't know any better. Or maybe he did. Because from that moment on, the emperor stopped looking at horses. He started looking at Basil. Michael was born into power, but he never quite grew into it. He was an emperor by name, a drunk by habit, and a child by temperament. He liked races, jesters, wine, and anything that made the court forget he was on the throne, especially men who obeyed without speaking. When he first saw Basil, he wasn't looking for loyalty. He was looking for a distraction. The stable hand didn't bow right, didn't know how to stand in royal presence, but he had a back that could carry 2 barrels of water uphill, and a face that didn't flinch when slapped. That was exotic enough for Michael. Within days, Basil was reassigned, no longer a stable hand. Now, companion of the emperor. No one explained what that meant. No one needed to. At court, they called him the dog. Michael called him brother. And when drunk, he called him mine. There was no ceremony. One morning, Basil simply stopped returning to the stables. He was now housed in the palace wing nearest the emperor, fed with the emperor, dressed by the emperor's tailor, seen always beside the emperor and never behind him. He still didn't speak much, didn't need to. His silence became part of the furniture. When guests asked who the broad-shouldered man was, Michael would grin. "The horses miss him," he'd say. But the way he said it, you'd think it was Basil doing the riding now. People whispered, they always whispered, that the emperor had a pet, that the pet was being trained, that maybe, just maybe, the leash was in the wrong hand. Basil smiled, the kind of smile that says nothing, but remembers everything. She was the emperor's favorite. Eudokia Ingerina, sharp eyes, sharper tongue, and a face that made bishops lose sermons. Michael loved her. But love in Byzantium was never convenient. She wasn't noble enough, not pious enough, not quiet enough. So to silence the court, Michael married her off. To Basil. A gift, a gesture, a cover story. They called it a political arrangement. But everyone knew what it was, even Basil. He didn't object. He'd been trained not to. The emperor gave him a woman, like one gives a loyal dog a bone. And Basil took her. Just like he took orders. Just like he took his silence. Some nights, the palace heard 2 beds creaking. Other nights, only one. The guards pretended not to notice. The servants pretended not to listen. The patriarch pretended not to exist. The baby came too soon, too healthy, too royal-looking. No one asked who the father was, especially not Basil. He just held the child, like it belonged to someone else. Basil was now a husband, in public at least. In private, he was still whatever the emperor needed him to be. He had 2 roles, 2 beds, and too many eyes watching him from the shadows. None of them blinked, because no one knew which role he was playing tonight. To the court, it was scandalous. To Michael, it was amusing. To Basil, it was survival. They laughed about it. The emperor and his stable hand. One ruled the empire, the other ruled the hours between dusk and dawn. And Eudokia? She wore her crown like a joke she refused to explain. She carried a child on one hip and silence on the other. At official feasts, Basil sat beside the emperor. At night, he lay between the emperor's woman and the emperor's reach. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a placeholder, a name for a body everyone used, but no one wanted to claim. Except history. History never forgets the dog when it learns to bite. The child was named Leo, not Basil, not Michael, just Leo. That was safer. He looked too perfect, too symmetrical, too imperial. When nurses passed him around, their hands trembled, as if holding proof of an affair no one could prove. Basil held the boy, but never too long. Never like a father. Always like a servant returning something that wasn't his. Michael, on the other hand, beamed. He called Leo my little victory, and gave him gifts before he could walk. Robes, rings, a tiny crown. Basil said nothing. He knew what Leo was. A bloodline, a legacy, a ticking accusation with dimples. The court watched. The whispers grew. Some said the emperor had given Basil a throne to sit on, but not one to pass on. Others said the boy would grow up to replace them both. Only one man said nothing. Only one man kissed the child quietly before bed and held the dagger a little tighter every night. No one knew what Basil did to earn it. There was no war, no heroic act, no divine vision in the sky. Yet in the year 866, Michael III proclaimed it publicly. Basil would be crowned co-emperor of Byzantium, a stable hand, a slave. Now a ruler by decree, not by blood. The court gasped, then applauded. What else could they do? The patriarch hesitated. Michael laughed. "Don't worry," he said. "He's not replacing me, he's just keeping my seat warm." But even warmth in palaces becomes dangerous. Basil wore the crown like it was borrowed, spoke little, smiled less. But behind that silence, a plan was blooming. He watched how Michael drank too deeply, how his guards grew lazy, how his lover, his own wife, stopped looking at him with fear. Basil wasn't a usurper. He was a student, and the throne was his classroom. Every joke the emperor made about him was being studied for weakness. And every time Michael said brother, Basil nodded and thought, not for long. Power in Byzantium was rarely taken. It was offered, drunk, laughing, and too distracted to notice. Michael still thought he was in control. He wore the purple. But Basil wore the patience. The emperor grew careless. He held races while the treasury bled. He invited fools to council and exiled men of reason. And always, at his side, Basil. Watching. Smiling when needed. Silent when not. Michael called him my shadow. But shadows don't stay loyal forever, especially when they learn how to move without the light. Eudokia saw it first. She stopped laughing at court, stopped drinking at feasts, started praying again. Leo, now a boy, was taught to greet both men as father and never ask why. Meanwhile, Michael gave Basil keys to the palace, to the treasury, to the guard commander's ear. The joke had gone too far, and no one knew how to take it back, except Basil. He didn't laugh anymore. He was counting. Rooms, allies, doors without locks, and nights without witnesses. It happened after dinner. Michael was drunk. Too drunk to stand, but not too drunk to command. He told everyone to leave except Basil. The guards laughed as they always did. The emperor had his pet, and the pet had his leash. They didn't know the leash had snapped months ago. Basil helped Michael to bed, pulled off his boots, undressed him like a servant would, and waited. Waited for the last cup of wine to kick in, for the torchlight to dim, for the emperor's breathing to slow. Then, a movement. Fast, quiet, intentional. By the time the guards returned, Michael was still. The sheets were clean. There was no blood, just silence, and Basil sitting beside the body. When they asked what happened, he said, "The emperor fell asleep." No one asked why his dagger was missing. No one asked why the doors had been locked. In Byzantium, emperors died all the time, but never this cleanly, never this politely, and never with their killer wearing such a calm face. There was no riot, no rebellion, no divine omen streaking across the sky. The next morning, Basil was crowned. The corpse was gone before sunrise. The priests said their prayers with practiced indifference. The court bowed, some with fear, others with calculation. And the guards? They kept standing where they always had. Nothing changed, except everything. Eudokia didn't cry. She stood beside Basil in silence, her veil perfectly arranged. She didn't wear black, she wore power. Leo, still too young to understand, was told to kneel. He did, before the man who might be his father, or his father's murderer, or both. Basil's voice didn't tremble when he swore to protect the empire. It never had. He didn't thank the emperor before him, didn't mention his name. Because in Byzantium, forgetting was a form of justice. He ascended the throne wearing a borrowed crown, but no one dared to ask whose. After all, dead emperors don't leave testimonials, and the living ones don't need permission. He kept her. Eudokia gift, lover, witness, liability. Now, Empress. No one asked what she knew. No one asked what she felt. They only asked how she managed to look so composed. But she had always been composed. Even when her bed was shared between emperors, even when her son became a political riddle, even when the man she once called husband placed a crown on her head, after killing the man she truly loved. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply adjusted the hem of her robe and stood beside Basil, as if she'd never stood anywhere else. Some say she was broken. Others say she was calculating. But Byzantium had no space for mourning, only for roles, and she still had one left to play. The mother. The empress. The woman who stayed alive. Because in this empire, survival wasn't about loyalty. It was about knowing when to speak and when to let the silence do the ruling. Leo was growing. He had Michael's eyes, Michael's nose, Michael's smile. And Basil hated all three. The boy was too clever, too calm, too familiar with corridors his feet shouldn't know yet. Basil never struck him, never raised his voice. That would have been honest. Instead, he trained the boy with distance, praise that never came, favors given to others, a father's hand that only rested on his shoulder when witnesses were watching. Everyone whispered that Leo wasn't Basil's son, but no one said it loud, because the last man who did was reassigned to a post without walls or oxygen. Leo asked questions about portraits, about names not spoken, about why the emperor never called him son. Basil answered with a lesson. Blood is not what makes a man my heir. Silence is. And Leo learned quickly. Michael's name vanished faster than his body. No public mourning, no state funeral, no day of remembrance. Just edits. Manuscripts were rewritten. Coins were melted. Mosaics were quietly scraped down to gold tile. In the palace archives, entire reigns were reduced to footnotes, and footnotes were deleted. Basil didn't scream his legitimacy. He erased the need for it. He funded churches, commissioned frescoes, donated to monasteries who now remembered only one emperor him. He renamed festivals, built monuments, and when asked who came before him, he answered with a smile. Does it matter? It didn't. Byzantium had seen assassins before, but rarely one this clean, this methodical, this effective. He didn't need loyalty. He needed forgetfulness. And the empire, as always, was eager to forget, especially when paid in gold. Basil rewrote his own origin. The stables became military service. His illiteracy, humble roots, the emperor he murdered, a misguided soul, blessed be his memory. In public inscriptions, he was Basil the Wise. In court poetry, Basil the Chosen. By the church, Basil the Defender of the Faith. He wasn't hiding his past. He was polishing it, like a dagger dressed in silk. He had no bloodline, so he manufactured one, hired scholars to find ancient ancestors, paid priests to trace prophecies backward until they pointed to him. Icons began to appear, paintings of Basil beside saints, sometimes even glowing, sometimes even taller than Christ. Byzantium had seen liars before, but never one who made the lie feel like gospel. He didn't just sit on the throne. He rewrote the steps leading to it. And when the people looked up, they didn't see a slave who stole power. They saw a ruler chosen by God, with just enough gold to prove it. Basil had it all: the robe, the crown, the silence of the people who once called him stable hand. But he was alone. Eudokia no longer touched him, not with her hands, not with her eyes. She spoke to him like to a guest who had overstayed, a necessary presence, a permanent absence. Leo grew taller, sharper, more imperial with every step. The court began to nod when he entered, and that nod lasted longer than when Basil did. The laughter had died. The court was quiet, not out of fear but out of boredom. No more scandal, no more seduction. Just a man sitting on a throne built from the people he outlived. He had risen by being useful, and now there was no one left to use him. At night he walked the halls alone. Rooms once filled with desire now echoed with drafts. He had everything, except the two things that built his empire: attention and touch. Death didn't come by sword or poison. It came the way it always does for old men with too much history. Quiet and late. Basil grew sick, but not fast enough to be pitied, and not dramatically enough to be remembered. He refused to stay in bed, refused to pray, refused to name Leo his successor, at least not with warmth. He muttered orders no one followed, summoned allies who had already shifted loyalties. Eudokia never visited. Leo stood in the doorway once and left without speaking. The empire waited, not for a funeral, for permission. When Basil finally collapsed, alone in a chamber filled with gifts he never opened, the palace didn't scream. It exhaled. No coup, no assassins. Just an empty throne, and a servant who'd sat in it too long. His death wasn't tragic. It was overdue. And in Byzantium, that was the closest thing to justice. Leo didn't cry. At the funeral, he stood still, No tears, no trembling, no final words. He wore black, but only because protocol demanded it, not grief. The court bowed to him now, not cautiously, eagerly. A boy once caught between two men was now the only man that mattered. There was no day of national mourning, no poets weeping in public squares, no church bells echoing regret, just a short ceremony, a closed coffin, and a name chiseled into stone with less care than it took to write a tax order. When asked what he remembered about his father, Leo said, "He worked hard." That was it. No legacy, no myth. Just an old man who rose too far, lived too long, and died in a palace that never truly let him in. The empire moved on, faster than he ever had, and Basil, who once filled every hallway, was now just another ghost, politely ignored. Basil left behind no letters, no confessions, no final command, just silence. But silence in Byzantium was always filled by others. The new scribes called him a restorer. The bishops called him pious. The generals called him pragmatic. The people, when they spoke of him at all, called him lucky. No one mentioned the emperor he replaced. No one asked why the mosaics of Michael had vanished. No one remembered that Basil had once answered to a whip, not a crown. He had rewritten his story so well, even the truth began to forget itself. Only a few noticed the strangeness. A dynasty built on no bloodline, no inheritance, no war, just proximity, opportunity, and the ability to stay quiet while others got drunk. He wasn't loved. He wasn't feared. He was accepted. And in Byzantium, that was the highest form of victory, to be remembered just enough to never be questioned. Years later, historians struggled. How to describe Basil? A usurper? A reformer? A lucky servant with a sharp knife? He didn't fit neatly. Too brutal to be noble. Too effective to be dismissed. He wasn't born to rule, he stole it. But he ruled longer than most men who were. He funded churches while killing emperors, protected borders while erasing legacies, slept with power, then wore it like silk. He was Byzantium distilled, a paradox dressed in purple. You couldn't love him. You couldn't ignore him. And when you tried to explain him, he slipped between categories like oil through fingers. Was he evil or just fluent in empire? One scribe finally gave up. He wrote, "Basil was what happens when survival becomes sacred." And that was the only line no one dared edit. He slept with the emperor. He slept with his woman. He took his throne. And yet, Basil was never fully in the story, only in its margins. He entered through a bedroom, climbed through favors, ruled through silence. No prophecy, no divine birth. Just a man who saw an open door and walked in before anyone else noticed. He didn't inspire, he infected. Not like a storm, like mold, slow, inevitable, permanent. The empire didn't rise under him, it twisted, became sharper, colder, more honest. Because for once, the lie wasn't pretending to be noble. It wore a crown and smiled without apology. That was Basil's true legacy. Not survival, not reform. But this. He proved that you don't need to be born into power. If you can make everyone forget how you got there,